My name is David Dukas, and I direct the program in medical ethics and human values here at Tulane University. And I'm very pleased to host today's J.R. Williams Senior MD 31. So that's the class of 31 from Tulane Endowed Lecture Series. It's entitled The Ethics of Access, Abortion Care, and Reproductive Justice in Tumultuous Times, in which Katie Watson will be presenting from Northwestern University. I'm very pleased to be able to have this venue in that the Williams family has endowed this fund, and it was initiated in 2013. It supports lectures on spirituality and health, but also on ethics and humanities. And it focuses on the art of creating a compassionate and trusting relationship between doctor and patient. The series honors the legacy of J. Richard Williams, who was a Tulane University graduate, well-known and well-loved internist and oncologist in Selma, Alabama. Dr. Williams loved medicine and was the kind of doctor who would do everything and anything for his patient, with an interest on impact on spirituality of health, particularly on the impact on the well-being and continued health of those who had suffered the loss of a loved one. Remember, he graduated in the class of 31, so he practiced oncology from the late 30s up until, I believe it was the late 60s, early 70s. Much oncology then really was palliative care in nature. I would be remiss if I did not also mention that we have an MS in Bioethics and Medical Humanities who co-sponsor this talk. We are on the web at tulane.edu/bioethics and also on YouTube at Tulane Bioethics, real easy to find. We have both a bioethics track, which focuses on teaching, research, and service through ethics committees and IRBs, and in teaching and conducting normative and empirical ethics. And we also have a medical humanities track, which focuses on teaching and research in narrative, reflective writing, fine arts, and history and healthcare. We have a 1 or 2 year program, which is now quite flexible. And also we have a longer term program for those who are doing this as mid-career professionals, where they can't take the concentrated amount of hours normally done. We also have an integrated dual degree MDMS 4-year program, and offer 3 different 12-hour certificates in clinical ethics, research ethics, and medical humanities. Here is our web link, but also a QR code. If you have a cell phone, you can take a picture of it and it'll take you right to the tulane.edu/bioethics site. And if you have further questions, you can reach both Dr. Stephen Hansen, Director of Graduate Studies, and Sofie Offengenden, who is the MS Program Manager, and both of their emails are listed. Now on to the introduction. So I'm very pleased to introduce Katie Watson. I've known Professor Watson for quite a few years now, since my days at the University of Louisville and my involvement in the PRIME project. Professor Watson is an associate professor of medical education, medical social science, and OBGYN, and core faculty in the Medical Humanities and Bioethics graduate program at the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. She is a graduate of NYU School of Law. After law school, she clerked in the federal judiciary, practiced public interest law, and then completed fellowships in clinical medical ethics at the University of Chicago's Medical School and in medical humanities at Northwestern, and then joined the Northwestern University faculty. She has produced articles on abortion ethics and practice in such journals as JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, and the New Yorker. She's the co-editor of Reproductive Ethics in Clinical Practice from Oxford Press in 2021, and is the author of Scarlet A, The Ethics, Law, and Politics of Ordinary Abortion, Oxford again in 2018, which the New York Times reviewed as revolutionary and recommended as one of the top 10 books to understand the abortion debate in the United States. High praise indeed. Dr. Watson is a member of the Northwestern Memorial Hospital Ethics Committee, the Ethics Committee of the International Federation of Gynecology and Obstetrics, and Planned Parenthood National Medical Council. And she is a former member of the boards of the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities and the National Abortion Federation and the editorial board of the AMA Journal of Ethics. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Katie Watson, who will speak on the ethics of access, abortion care, and reproductive justice in tumultuous times.
Thank you so much, David.
Yeah.
Let me share my screen. Here we go. Terrific. We all know the title. Disclosures. My only off-label reference will be to people taking medication abortion without a doctor's prescription, which is indeed off-label. Hello. Approximately 6 months ago, the Supreme Court, for the first time in history, reversed a major civil rights precedent. It had reversed itself on several occasions in the past, but in the area of civil rights and civil liberties, always to give Americans more rights, not less. And so this has led to many changes and much confusion. But in the realm of abortion, it's led to incredible tumult. And I understand that I'm speaking to people on this call living in radically different legal and cultural contexts. And I'm going to try to address them broadly, but I'm very excited to hear your questions and comments as well. But my overall observation is it's difficult to know where to focus in such tumultuous times. And today I want to suggest two possibilities. One is making sure you understand the difference between availability and accessibility of abortion care. And two, understanding abortion care in the broader framework of reproductive justice. I have two basic premises, is that I assume there are as many perspectives that are nuanced and rich on the ethics of abortion as there are people in this audience. And I want to say at the outset, I respect them all. I also respect that there's a comparable range among the patients you serve, and we all work with and for. And as a clinical ethicist, that's where my loyalty lies. And because I want them to have the range of options, I will be very transparent that I support abortion's legality, which is very separate from the conversation, or related to, but separate in a doctor-patient relationship to their conversation about abortion ethics. And the second is I hope we have a shared value of equity in healthcare. I think it matters when we have inequitable access, and I think it matters which patients get which services, when and why. I was doing a traditional abortion ethics lecture for you today, I think we would be focusing almost exclusively on the moral status of embryos and fetuses. But I, in my work, have come to believe that discussing the moral status of embryos and fetuses without discussing the people in whom they live and their moral status is a form of intellectual violence. It's also just bad bioethics. From my first day at the McLean Center, I was taught that to do good ethics analysis, you have to have all the medical facts. And the accurate medical fact is that all embryos and fetuses live in uteruses, and all uteruses are located in human beings. So this basketball picture is to remind me to share with you that my basketball career started and ended in 7th grade. I'm terrible at sports. But the one thing I remember from it has turned out to be foundational to my scholarship in ethics. Who would have thought? Which is when you're trying to guard someone, don't watch the head. The eyes and the head can fake you out. They can lie. You follow the body. And so I'm so much less interested in what Americans tell Gallup they think about abortion than what they do when they're confronted with an unintended pregnancy. And let's be clear that unintended doesn't mean unwanted. Many people on this call are the third whoops baby who is absolutely welcome in their family, but the data doesn't separate unintended and unwanted yet. But 42% of those unintended pregnancies end in abortion. 20% of all American pregnancies in 2020 ended in abortion. And 1 in 4 women of reproductive age will have one at some point. So I just start with the premise that people with uteruses have been voting with their feet for 49 years that this is important health care for them. So as a result of those commitments to focus on the moral status of the person in whom the embryo and fetus lives, and to take that into account, I try to focus on the lived experience versus the totally abstract philosophical idea divorced from the actual practice of medicine. And I want to say that I reject any claim that any one person has a higher moral ground than another to speak on behalf of embryos and fetuses. We are all former fetuses, and regardless of where we are in the spectrum of beliefs about abortion ethics. That doesn't mean that in this lecture I'm ignoring the moral status of embryos and fetuses. What I'm doing is taking very seriously the foundational premise of the medical ethics revolution of the 60s and 70s, that patients are moral agents and they do moral reasoning and they bring their values to this medical context. This is just an example. When I wrote a piece for the New Yorker after spending 3 days at an Oklahoma City clinic that was flooded with Texas patients, I asked patients about their journey and their feelings, but I was really interested in their intellectual analysis of abortion ethics. And without hesitation, every patient had an ethical framework for when it was, why it was okay for her to have an abortion and when that would change for her. And 201, they said, when asked, what would you do if you were a legislator? They said, I wouldn't legislate any gestational age limit because I think everybody has their different reasons and moral perspectives, and I wouldn't want to control someone else with mine. They were very sophisticated conversations in my estimation for people who I think almost all lacked a college degree. So let's turn to away from the idea of abortion and make sure to really focus on the lived experience and epidemiology of abortion for a little bit here. So who do these bans most affect? Well, not everyone is aware that half of abortion patients have incomes under the federal poverty line, and another 26% are just in that 100 to 200% range, and that 62% are non-white. So we have a very disproportionate representation of women of color and people with low incomes. Now, why are women of color overrepresented? Well, a primary, though not exclusive reason is the tragic overlap between race and poverty and the product of structural racism and the poverty that has resulted. So because you see many low-income women, you're going to see a disproportionate amount of women of color in those statistics. So I do want to think about race, but let's shift to economics and SES. Why do you see so many poor women in those statistics disproportionately represented? Well, women with incomes under the poverty line have 5 times more pregnancies than women with incomes above 200% of the poverty line. So it stands to reason that you'd see more of a demand for abortion services in a group that has a very high unintended pregnancy level. So that's just a basic epidemiological fact that we all need to understand. As a result, over the years, there's a combination of factors here. Think of IUDs and other highly effective birth control methods being developed over the years, but the first access going to higher income women with more secure health insurance and more comfort with the medical system. There's a combination of things happening here, but the end result is that abortion in the United States is increasingly concentrated among poor women. That trend is going up. However, a statistic that is, in my experience, never discussed is the fact that higher income women terminate more of our unintended pregnancies. So at 200 plus, only 30% of pregnancies are unintended. And I mean, that's a third. Like, people in the higher income brackets not crushing it on the unintended pregnancy, right? When we think about public health and primary care ideas of prevention. But we terminate 48% of our unintended pregnancies, only delivering 9 unintended per 1,000. Under the poverty line, we've got that high rate of unintended pregnancy, but they only terminate 38% of their unintended pregnancies, which leads to a 60 per 1,000 unintended pregnancy delivery rate. Now, what accounts for that difference in abortion usage in the percentages? Is it a difference in values? Maybe. Is it a difference in access to abortion care? I think there's a strong hypothesis that that is a large part of it. And in an article I wrote this summer, I propose a very ethical natural experiment, which is repeal the Hyde Amendment and let poor women have economic insurance coverage for abortion access. And we would find out how much of that is a values difference and how much of that is a financial access difference. But it's important to note in terms of this economic disparity. So why are 1 in 4 women ending a pregnancy? And for women 44 plus, the number's 1 in 3. Our abortion rates at the time of Dobbs were the lowest they'd been since Roe versus Wade. For multiple reasons. But women in this study, this is a Guttmacher study that was surveyed, I think, over 4,000 women across the country in abortion clinics, and they were allowed to check more than one reason. And it won't surprise many people that decision-making was multifactorial, and the median number of reasons for abortion was 4. But I just want you to note, can't afford to have a baby right now was almost 3/4 of people checked that box. When they asked people what was the most important reason, can't afford a baby now is still one of the top 2 reasons. And that kind of economic pressure, I don't mean to suggest every single person in this category, if they won the lottery, would go forward with their pregnancy. It was multifactorial. So if you're in the 8% that also doesn't want to be a single parent, and that's what you're looking at, maybe that would still tip you to end the pregnancy. But I think it's important to understand the constrained context of decision-making. Maureen Paul is a collaborator at Harvard, and she said this in conversation. She's also very influenced by the reproductive justice movement, as am I. And I really appreciated that clinically, she said she has stopped using the word choice. She always uses the word decision. I think it takes a lot to have a real choice. And I think that's important when we think about choice in all areas of medicine. But I think in abortion care, the constraints are particularly profound in the decision-making of whether to have an abortion, and then the decision-making of, is it even possible for me to end this pregnancy? So thinking about the difference between accessibility and availability. So economic coercion, I think that checking I can't afford a baby is a form of economic coercion. It's environmental. We sort of, I won't say we accept poverty, but we understand nothing a physician can do today to change their patient's economic circumstances. And we know health outcomes are very driven by your economic status. But I just want to highlight, this has become so normalized, but that women who are insured by Medicaid get all their basic health care covered, except for this one procedure. The Hyde Amendment is federal. You all know on this call that the Medicaid program is a joint federal state program. So states can choose to pay for procedures that the federal Medicaid doesn't cover. And the green states are the states where the states have said, we'll pony up and cover either more expanded or completely expanded abortion care. But I want to highlight for you the fact that Black and Hispanic and Native women are 2 times as likely to be insured by Medicaid as white women. So there's a racial component here too. There's the economic component, but then the overlapping racial component that concerns me about inequitable access. So what the result is this difference between legality is abortion available? Can you get to an abortion clinic determines whether abortion is accessible. So Colorado is a great example. It's in Lilac here. It's a state with like very full protections for abortion care, but no Medicaid coverage. So you could be living next door to the abortion clinic, but not be able to raise the $500 in cash that you need to do the procedure because you must pay out of pocket, right? So even though abortion is technically available to you, it's not accessible. And comparably, if you're a professor at Tulane, you're living in a state where abortion is not available, but perhaps your income and your flexible work schedule means you can get on an airplane and that abortion is relatively accessible to you, right? So we can't conflate those two. There was a very elegant study, in my opinion, by Sarah Roberts at UCSF and her colleagues that took place in Louisiana. So I want to highlight that for a Tulane audience. They, instead of interviewing women in abortion clinics, which is the typical study, they interviewed women in prenatal care clinics across Louisiana and asked, was there ever a time where you considered not going forward with this pregnancy? And if yes, what's your insurance source? And if they were on Medicaid, asking if what role Medicaid coverage did or did not play in their decision. And based on the women who said, yes, I couldn't afford an abortion and Medicaid didn't cover it, but it covers prenatal care. So here I am. They extrapolated and estimated that approximately 3,000 women a year insured by Medicaid in Louisiana give birth instead of having an abortion, just based on that economic coercion and government policy. I think that's profound, and it's food for thought as we move forward in this conversation. As bioethicists, we care very much about autonomy, and it's important we think about all the ways our patients or people who want to become patients, their autonomy is stripped before they come in the door. So in this article I referenced that it was a Target article in AJOB this summer, I just simply asked, why don't we ever think about abortion care as a health disparity? We have race, class, as in a moment I'll talk more about gender, and I think it's a form of abortion exceptionalism, which means treating abortion as if it has nothing in common with any other medical procedure or social issue, and not using our typical frameworks to look at it. And of course it's unique in the same way that transplant ethics are unique and pediatrics is unique because minors can't consent. And, each specialty has its unique elements, but they also have their overlaps, and we can think about them collectively as well, and fruitfully so. But we don't do that as often in abortion care as I think as ethicists we should. So, in the Dobbs case, to return to this, I think everyone on this call understands the Dobbs ruling. What's most troubling to me about the Dobbs ruling is the rationale. The question was raised because substantive due process, the idea that the 14th Amendment isn't just about procedure, but has substance behind it, it's part of the privacy doctrine, is that it was the groundwork of the contraception cases and also the gay rights cases. The privacy doctrine was developed in 1965 in the first contraception case, Griswold. So Justice Thomas says these other cases should also be overturned because get rid of substantive due process. He is not a fan of the doctrine. He's a literalist, saying this is just what's in the Constitution and the words of the Constitution. And that is an intellectually honest approach. It's one I disagree with passionately, but it's intellectually honest for its consistency. What was profound was that the majority said, no, don't worry about those cases. We'll see if they're telling the truth later, but they said, don't worry about those cases. What distinguishes abortion from those rights is it terminates a potential life or potential life. Well, the majority didn't grant personhood under the Constitution to embryos and fetuses. So what could possibly allow a state to prioritize the interests of the embryo that lives inside me over mine, except that if I'm not fully a person protected by the Constitution? Right? Think about that for a second. Roe analyzed the 16 uses of the word person in the Constitution and said none of them have any possible prenatal application. Roe does not get credit for being a completely originalist type of decision in many ways. However, it said, well, implied, there's no question that women are people under the Constitution. So here's how we would balance that. So there's a false neutrality in returning it to the states and saying, well, they can decide if women are people. This is the most troubling part of Dobbs to me. but perhaps it shouldn't be surprising. So on the third leg of the disparities analysis, thinking about gender, let me give you a quick history run to remind you that the legal recognition of women's personhood is actually historically very recent. We can't speak of women as a monolithic group. Women of African descent had no constitutional claim to personhood until after abolition. But many people don't remember, or, were never taught that before abolition, and it took 50 years, 1848 was the first, women were legally, their legal identities were subsumed in their fathers or their husbands. We didn't have a separate legal identity. So for example, you couldn't have money in your own name. You couldn't sign a contract. There's a case I'm going to talk to you about in a moment. And it's only been 100 years since we've had the right to vote. 100 years feels like a long time to someone like me, but a historian will be very quick to tell you that's the blink of an eye, right? And then I want to mention the 1961 case of Hoyt versus Florida. The Bradwell case is a case I love to hate because it's about a woman lawyer in Illinois, and that feels familiar. Mrs. Bradwell went to law school, and her husband had a legal practice, and she wanted to be licensed as a lawyer in Illinois, but she couldn't be because she could not legally sign a contract. And the Bar Association said, and the regulatory body said, well, if you can't sign a contract between you and your client, establishing that fiduciary duty and confidentiality and the payment, then you can't represent them. So she took her case to the Supreme Court because she was a really good lawyer. She didn't argue it, but she wrote the stuff, and her husband helped her with his bar card. And the Supreme Court, the majority, 7 said, we're not going to get involved in these state administrative professional regulation matters. They can do whatever they want. But 3 of them could not resist writing a concurrence that just screamed, it's because she's a girl. And what they did is provide this very elegant articulation of what's called the 2 spheres theory, that women are meant to be at home, they're meant to be wives and mothers, men are meant to be in the public sphere, and that's a natural order of things, that the gender separation is actually a divine separation. And so women can't have jobs. So they could have just gone with the majority and kept this to themselves, but they wrote it as Supreme Court opinion, which I think lets you know something about the culture of the time, or at least a strong cultural thread of the time. So flash forward to Hoyt versus Florida. Mrs. Hoyt in 1961 was accused of murdering her husband, and she was convicted by an all-male jury. And so almost 100 years later, we have another equity claim. The Supreme Court had a hot run of equal protection jury cases at this point, saying Black men in the South or anywhere cannot be convicted by all white juries that exclude Black people from being in the box, because that's not a jury of your peers racially. So Mrs. Hoyt said, I think these equal protection precedents apply to me too. Why weren't there women in the jury box or in the jury pool? Florida had a system where women were excluded, but they could show up and raise their hand and volunteer. 0 women ever did that, right? And the Supreme Court says, no, those cases don't apply to you, ma'am. That Florida, you women, we're very groovy, we're very advanced, but women are still the center of home and family. And so it's okay for Florida to say only women who want to come and determine that that service is consistent with their special responsibilities, which in my house is called parenting today. But that's 1961, again, not so long ago. So I also think it's important to contextualize this within legislation, the reproductive cases. So in 1963, you can't pay us less just because we're women. 64, you can't not hire us because we're women. Oh, look, we get the contraceptive cases. And it's interesting historically, like there's a reason these things are happening in the years they are. And remember, before Griswold, the FDA has approved the oral contraceptive pill. Suddenly there's woman-controlled and promises to be highly effective contraception. That's why that's going to court now. She needs to get to a doctor to get it. It's not a drugstore method or a male-controlled method. In 72, we get, you can't keep us out of college just because we're women, and high school and sports. We get Roe, then we get the PDA. You can't fire us just because we're pregnant. So think about that sphere of worker and mother coming together. And it was common practice to fire women who were pregnant. Then we get Casey, and Casey does not give an equal protection grounding. This is the case affirming Roe, but it it pretty much says it in its text. It situates it in to collapse those two spheres and allow women to move between them the way men always have been allowed to. We have to have reproductive control. And then in 93, the FMLA says, hold my job, I'm coming back, right? So the final walls of that two-sphere flow. It's not just I'll work until I'm pregnant or while I'm pregnant, I will work while I'm mothering too, potentially. So the equal protection argument was developed in 1984. It wasn't available in 73. It was developed in 84 by Professor Sylvia Law at NYU, who was my mentor, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote separate articles in 1984 saying, there's this whole other textual basis besides privacy, that women's biological differences have been the historical ground for discriminating against them. And that any equality doctrine that denies the reality of those biological differences reflects an idea about personhood that's inconsistent with people's actual experience of themselves in the world. So the Supreme Court in Dobbs, there was a equal protection brief written by a bunch of law professors saying, well, if you don't like privacy, let's have the Supreme Court for the first time really seriously consider an equal protection argument for grounding abortion rights. And the court dismissed it in a page. It says, that argument is squarely foreclosed by our precedents, and it cites two cases with this new theory addressed. And so we're going to spend over 100 pages reversing a almost 50-year precedent, but the equal protection grounds, those precedents we can't touch, right? The absurdity and asymmetry, I hope, is striking to you. And I want to tell you about Geduldig as another case in the love to hate category. And I would argue it historically will later be looked back on the same way that we might look at Bradwell and Hoyt. Geduldig was a case where the California employment disability scheme covered all disabilities except explicitly excluded pregnancy as a covered disability. So women, this is pre-FMLA, they had to take unpaid leave for pregnancy. And the argument was, well, we should get, when we have to deliver a child, you're in the hospital, that should be considered a disability. You delivered a child, you were unable to work for a certain period of time. And the Supreme Court said no. And the short version of their reasoning of why this wasn't an equal protection, and they had cases of men who had been drunk driving and crashed into a tree, get all these disability benefits because they can't work, all these other, quote, self-inflicted disabilities. And the Supreme Court's analysis basically said, well, think of it as two rooms. In one room, we have the pregnant people who are all women, but in the other room, we have the non-pregnant people. And many of those people are also women. So it's not sex discrimination because it's not just men and women, it's men and women in the non-pregnant room, which is sort of bizarre because at any given point, yes, there's more people in the non-pregnant room, but 85% of American women are going to cycle through the pregnant room and have a pregnancy at some point in time, right? And so it's a snapshot versus a longitudinal analysis of the fact that in the pregnancy room, it will be exclusively women. And today we would say people capable of pregnancy, but using the terms of the 70s, it's exclusively women and no men ever rotate through the pregnancy room, right? To say that that's not an equal protection issue, I think is challenging. Think of it if there was a menstrual hut at work that you had to go into, and they said, well, some women are not in the menstrual hut at any given time, and then some women don't menstruate at all. So this is not gender; it's just about menstruation. You would be like, I'm missing something about lived experience here, right? But that's the precedent that the court in one page said it just had to defer to and wasn't going to do any analysis. So I think it's clear. I made it clear. I find this troubling. I think that we need a new framework to think about reproductive ethics and law. And I want to share with those of you who are not familiar and to hopefully invigorate those who are to think about the reproductive justice framework. So in 1994, 2 years after the Casey case, affirming abortion rights, women in Chicago, Black women in Chicago, were approached by representatives of the Clinton administration, asking them to support the draft of the Clinton health plan. And the draft had already excluded reproductive care to not be controversial. And the idea of these women was, well, if the primary or one of the primary points of healthcare contact in our community, and for many women, but in our community, is reproductive health care, you've already cut us out of the plan before it's even out of the gate. So why are you here asking for our support? And what they did in response was develop a different intellectual framework for thinking about reproductive ethics that they coined reproductive justice. So in law school, I was taught about reproductive freedom, and that's the negative right to be alone, left alone, and the right to not have children. So were I to show you all the language from the contraceptive and abortion cases, that's the government out of my bedroom idea, right? It's a negative right to be left alone. A reproductive justice framing says, that does not comport with the historical experience of women of color. We definitely need a right to not have children, but our right to have children has been challenged, whether it's from the times of slavery and having our children taken away from us, or forced reproduction, to the welfare system punishing and destroying families for the crime of being poor, to forced sterilizations, forced contraception. We need an equivalent, equally important right to have children, as well as to not have children. And we also need a right to parent the children we have in dignity and safety. The point of having them was to raise them to live and flourish. And that this should be a positive right, that if you need help from the government to do these things, this is more of a human right framing than a negative right. We're all these atomistic, automatic creatures on our own. And for me, when we think about principlism, this really invigorates the principle of justice in a different way, brings a different kind of collective justice and historical lens, equity lens to our justice analysis. 20 years later, they added sexual autonomy and gender freedom, which I think is welcome. I'm not going to delve into that in this talk, but the idea that, like, why did we have these unintended pregnancies? Why are people having sex at all? That this should be part of the analysis. And finally, the idea that if you center the most marginalized, you'll get the best policy for everyone, versus centering middle-class, well-insured white women, you will get policy that leaves many people out. So let's take that seriously. And then this is new work, and my new next chapter of my work in abortion care focuses on mothering. I was struck when I went into these statistics, and perhaps you are too, that 59% of abortion patients already have a child. Mothers is not who I was stereotyped to imagine in the clinic waiting rooms. And then 88% are dating or married. And I think that's relevant because most of them talk to that partner. And it reminds us that, of course, for legal and medical purposes, we're treating individuals. This is happening in the context of romance and love and relationships and family. And that's the lived experience. We really don't value mothering in the United States, I think, and it's very important to put that front and center. I'm not saying that this particular article I wrote with one of our MA students is, so great. I'm just pointing out the paucity of the literature. There was only one qualitative study in the literature that looked at how desires around family formation could influence pregnant people's decision around abortion. And I just think, and this is the secondary analysis from that Guttmacher quantitative work I showed you. They did in-depth interviews of 39 people, and they all but one or two brought up the role of mothering. It wasn't on the question guide. And it just shows how bad our research is when we don't account for the lived experience of the people we're talking with. So, you have to ask the right question to get the right answers. So we had the opportunity to review narratives. A clinic had left out spiral-bound notebooks in the waiting room and in the recovery room and said, write what you want for yourself or others. So it's sort of a spontaneous journaling opportunity. And what we found was half of the people who volunteered, chose to write over 7 years, offered narratives talking about either their existing children, the embryo or fetus they were carrying, or the children they hope to have in the future as being central to their abortion decision-making. And here are just two representative quotes. The first about existing children, and the second about the idea of a future child. And I don't mean to valorize any particular reason for having an abortion and to say maternal reasoning is better than other reasoning or someone who doesn't want to have a child. I raise this because if you think an embryo or fetus is morally the same as a child, I understand that you'll disagree with their reasoning, but I hope you find it at least heartening to know you share a focus on child welfare with many abortion patients, as opposed to the stereotype that they are rejecting motherhood or this traditional role. And some are, and I say that's great. Each patient live by your North Light. But I think understanding who are the people in the clinics really matters. Sadly, many of your state governments don't share your focus on child welfare. I've highlighted Louisiana because we are at a 2-lane lecture, and I'm sad to see your 49th. There's a lot of these maps. This just happens to be from the Annie Casey Foundation, and they did these rankings in 4 domains. So it's economic, child poverty, child health, education, and family and community measures. And I am so struck by the overlap. The dark color at the bottom is the lowest quartile in child welfare. And it's not a perfect match, but look at the way it matches up with the abortion ban states that are also in our darker colors in this map. And I spent way too much time making little red boxes to not share this slide with you. We've all been in that PowerPoint rabbit hole. I am so struck when I lined up the maps to see that 75% of states in the child welfare 4th quartile have passed abortion bans. And that in the top half, 75% of the states have protected abortion rights. So for me, I look forward to hearing what you make of these maps in this discussion. But for me, it reinforces abortion bans are about the control of women or retaining an older version of gender roles as the hypothesis, as opposed to the love of children hypothesis. But regardless of what you make of this, looking forward, I think talking about abortion without talking about child and family policy is a mistake. This is as yet unpublished work, but I have been so struck by these 2 studies. These I won't say they're throwaways, but these quotes are not the focus of these studies. So I referenced the Guttmacher qualitative analysis of the 38 women interviewed after they had an abortion, where the mothering kept coming up. A third of them, so I guess it's 36 or 37 volunteer how mothering went into their decision making. A third of them volunteered about adoption, how that worked into their decision making. And a third volunteered, more than a third may have volunteered it, but this is the group that said this particular thing. They considered adoption and concluded that it was morally unconscionable because giving away your child is wrong. Similarly, there was a study out of UCSF called the Turnaway Study, where they focused on women who were at close to the gestational age limit of the clinic, so that some of them got turned away and subsequently continued a pregnancy. So I would put those in the unwanted category, right? You thought you were going to get an abortion, and the clinician told you, I can't, I won't, because you're further than you thought you were. Only 9% of them chose to place those infants for adoption. I would have thought they were the prime group for that. And some said that was because they believed adoption was an abdication of responsibility. So what we learned from this, again, we have very little data. Absolutely, some women think abortion is immoral. And note my earlier statistic that I showed you that 42% of unintended pregnancies end in abortion. Some of those are just mistimed but welcome, but some are truly unwanted. And that the other side of that number is women saying, I wouldn't be who I am if I had an abortion. It's wrong, I believe, and carrying those to term. We're seeing that range. So some women think abortion is immoral, but what we never have heard is that some women think adoption is immoral. I think they're asserting what I think of, and what I'll term in this upcoming work is the moral seriousness of motherhood. We talk a lot about the moral seriousness of ending a pregnancy. We don't talk a lot about the moral seriousness of choosing to create a new person in the world, and what that means as a parent and what obligations you owe to that individual. A theologian named Virginia Ramey Mollenkott calls it the covenant of caring. And I think that's just an elegant term for this. So what's happening in practice? This is a heat map, and I'm excited to say that word. It sounds very CSI, and I don't work in a world where I usually get to say heat map. But this is an economist at Middlebury College with an incredible team of undergrads who call abortion clinics every 2 weeks and say, how many patients do you have? Where are they coming from? And so remember that every woman of reproductive age today grew up with abortion being legal. And what we're finding is they are not continuing pregnancies against their will if they can help it. They are on the move. The travel is enormous. And in Chicago, we're seeing a lot of that. Now, there's a story here of drama and trauma and delay. So I don't think this is an okay state of affairs from a patient perspective, but I just want to share with you that women are not acceding to these bans. The Society for Family Planning did an amazing study with an incredible participation rate of abortion clinics in the US to track what was happening month by month with the patient census. And what they determined is in the first 2 months after Dobbs, the abortion rate dropped in the US by 6%. Now, 29% of women of reproductive age in the US live in a ban state, but the rate only dropped 6%. So that's a story of resistance and travel. But what's so important here is that's abortion by clinicians. How many of those women use self-managed abortion to end their pregnancies? We have no idea until the birth records in about, from about a year from Dobbs come out, when we find out what actually was the drop in the abortion rate. That's something we don't know. This is some political art by Shout Your Abortion, which I think is interesting. There's this large movement for women who can't travel or don't want to travel to try to use medication abortion ordered from international pharmacies. And I'm not endorsing any of these websites, but your patients in Louisiana might be going to them and ordering medication or learning information about self-managed abortion. For those who don't know, it's FDA approved to 10 weeks. Used across the country with great data to 11 weeks, very safe. It's people compare it to having a first trimester miscarriage at home in terms of the physical experience and the range of pain and bleeding that a first trimester miscarriage can cause. So we have to think about all that travel on safety and self-managed abortion. I'm very concerned about those 6% that didn't make it out. In just 2 months, that represents 10,000 abortions, 10,000 women. And I hope we'll get the later data. The bans may have trapped more people subsequently. We don't know yet. But the people who were in that 6% who couldn't travel and also didn't have whatever it takes to access self-managed abortion are likely to be our most vulnerable patients. And because the people on this call understand that Black women are at much higher risks of maternal morbidity and mortality, there's a great fear that as abortion becomes less accessible, we'll see the M&M rates for everybody rise, but for Black women, and go back to those statistics I showed you about race and poverty and who are the people seeking abortions, we're really, there's good reason to be very nervous about these statistics. It's also the case that travel pushes people later. So if you are someone who is more troubled ethically by second trimester abortion than first trimester abortion, I always say you should be an advocate for repealing the Hyde Amendment and reducing all regulations, because people are trying to get to clinics, but they get delayed the later the restrictions delay them and push them to later gestational ages. We are seeing in Illinois, not only patients are later, the data is not there, but I can just tell you anecdotally, we're seeing patients at later stages. Clinics report that the averages are going up. We're seeing them sicker too. So say they have a cardiac condition that doesn't qualify yet for a state health exception, but they know they need to terminate. So the clinics are seeing sicker patients and later patients. So I think that's very troubling. The Turnaway study, I want to leave time for discussion. So I'm going to breeze through these last few pinpoint slides. I thought this was fascinating. In the Turnaway study, when they compared first trimester patients to 20 plus patients, big difference in when they discovered they were pregnant. So think about informed decision making. You can't make a decision about what to do next until you know you have the medical condition under consideration. But then the access delays increased the difference by another 7 weeks. So pushed people to this 20 plus week age because of the barriers that were put up for them, and the increased expense of the money they had to raise. The later your procedure, the more expensive the procedure, involving different kind of anesthesia and that sort of thing. And so it takes a longer time for someone under the poverty line to raise that cash. So the last pinpoint is, I just want everyone in this call to understand that medication abortion before Dobbs accounted for the majority of all abortions, that it is the FDA approved, and they just dropped the requirement in person and formalized. So you should be able to just fill a prescription at a drugstore. However, there's a case in Texas with a district court judge who's been known to make very radical rulings that has specious allegations that the FDA didn't follow regulatory procedure in originally 22 years ago when the MAB was approved, and then also just recently when it dropped the in-person dispensing REMS requirement. That could take MAB off the market nationally for some period of time. And then the Fifth Circuit likely to confirm, given its leanings. Significant change. Dobbs didn't reverse the supremacy clause. If anyone wants to talk about health exceptions, I welcome that. But EMTALA still rules in the emergency room, though our hospitals are not behaving this way for reasons that may be understandable. But we know that when you wait for life-threatening symptoms, you get bad maternal morbidity outcomes. So it's forcing physicians to engage in malpractice, not follow practice guidelines. And this is an article I wrote with co-authors Maureen Paul, who I mentioned earlier. The idea that we're going to see more people in your emergency rooms in Louisiana who have done self-managed abortions and are concerned, is this too much bleeding? This hurts a lot. Is this okay? In Texas, there was a case where someone came and was transparent with their provider that she had taken pills. They called the police and she was arrested and jailed for 3 days until they figured out that that's not a crime. So I really want to emphasize, in no state statute is the woman herself criminalized. And regardless if she was, that's not how the emergency room is meant to operate under HIPAA. But somehow, again, abortion exceptionalism makes people feel free that somehow this is different than all other healthcare. And I just want to underscore, in the emergency room, it's not. So for me, the philosophical question we really are pondering here is, must biology be destiny? In the rest of medicine, we change our biology, and we let technology liberate people from conditions they don't care for and allow them to chart their own path. And I shared with you the statistics on on abortion, but just look at this decrease in birth rate. That is American women voting with their feet that they don't want to. And I mean, these are averages. There's a huge range of perspectives, but on average, accept that natural fertility of a large number of children. And we also see a dramatically increased age of first childbearing. So many women have told us they want to use these technologies. And I think going back to the two spheres analysis, where biology is destiny, wife and mother, that's your only role. Contemporary women, many of them are saying, I want to have multiple roles. And some of them are saying, I want to use this new medical technology to decide what those roles will be. And I think as ethicists, we've been remiss. Think of like Quinlan in 76, and then the Nancy Cruzan case in 92, and we think about technology and end of life. Well, I would propose abortion's been with us forever, but safe and effective abortion care has not, and effective contraception. So Roe in 73, Casey in 92, I put those as technology cases, changing culture and medicine, but we don't look at them that way in bioethics, and I think that's a mistake. So let me leave with this. I understand that abortion is a stigmatized topic that many people are uncomfortable talking about. I just want to say one of the reasons I'm so comfortable talking about it, one of the many, is that I'm always talking about some things that are much bigger than abortion. I'm a fan of government neutrality in private matters of reproduction. And I have these girls are darling, and that's part of the reason I have them up here. But I have them up here because they have mitten clips. And I am a fan of what I call mitten clip legislation. I think we should have affirmative support for parenting and the idea of childbearing. I think we should become a family-friendly country. In my work, the final observation I'll leave you with is that our right to not have children has become so painfully public. but our right to have children has remained painfully private. And so part of my project is to flip that lens of what we pay attention to and what we support going forward. And I think that is a matter of ethical concern. Thank you very much. And I so welcome your questions and comments. And in my program, we call this podium time. If those of you who want to stay past one and discuss a little longer, I'm happy to stick around if that's an option.
So I'm going to be checking in with our chat here for questions. If you could please post them there. One person right off the bat said, is it possible to have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation? If you could send that to Sophie, if you're comfortable with that, then anyone asking for it from her can go ahead and get it. Question one, how rigorous is awareness and use of family planning across income level? This is from Nicholas Jennings.
I won't claim to be intimately familiar with every bit of the family planning literature on this. I think there is disparity, absolutely, in awareness. There's definitely disparity in use, but one study I'll share with you that I found fascinating, the results of women of color were more likely to prefer what we would call low efficacy methods that did not require seeing a doctor and that they could stop themselves. And so they may have had an awareness of IUDs, but the historical legacy of mistrust that I don't want to have to talk to a doctor, and I don't trust that when I go back and say, now I want this out and I want to have a baby, that they'll take it out for me, or that I'll have the insurance coverage that allows that second visit a year or more later. So it's not just education and access. I think there's something additional going on, though education and access is a big piece. And with the ACA coverage of contraceptive care, we did see a boost in the higher effective methods being used across the board.
We have a query from Haley Director. How do you think social media has impacted our ability to talk about parenting and abortion across the country? Do you think social media is helping or hurting the goals that you discussed in your presentation?
I don't have a smart opinion about that because I'm allergic to social media. So Haley, maybe you do. My stock answer would be it rarely helps anything, but it also does disseminate information. So I'm not able to weigh the plus minus on that.
Okay. From Lydia Smith Osborne, are there updated statistics on the percentage of women who received an abortion that were also on regular or periodic birth control, and which types? It would be interesting to see that across demographics, SES as well.
That would be interesting. Lydia, if you're a health researcher, please do that study. I cannot wait to see it. I don't believe that it's broken out in that way, but there is definitely data. Women are using, I'd have to dig because Guttmacher changes its questions. It does every couple of years, does these surveys, and then adds some year unique questions. And I feel like 1 year they added a contraceptive question and found, a decent proportion were using contraception, but they weren't using it reliably, or they didn't know if you take an antibiotic when you're on an oral contraceptive, it doesn't work. So I feel like 1 year there was data for that, and we can dig for it, but it's not comprehensive.
David Myers asks, can you expand a bit on how hospitals and states with abortion bans deal with the legislative constraints? Are their licenses at risk? And have any been creative in providing care?
I think they're dealing with it poorly. And I have an article coming out soon in a journal, but I'm not allowed to say that, that is specifically a love letter to hospital counsel saying, step it up, friends. Here's what you need to do. Because I understand there's a risk management perspective that says, here's the cliff. We don't want to get within a mile of the cliff. And so in receiving states, we're seeing patients just with horror stories, fetal demise, miscarriage, but no one will empty her uterus because they don't want to do anything that could cause a phone call. And I feel very strongly that we And as ethicists, it's our job to toe the line, to not conflate, I am afraid of committing a felony and all that could flow from that, to I do not want a kerfuffle. I won't do anything that could cause a conversation, a conflict, a headline, a phone call, when a woman's health is at stake. This is an unacceptable, this is a legislatively imposed conflict of interest with performing standard evidence-based medicine to the person in front of you who has PPROM but still has, let's say, a fetal heartbeat. But when there's no universe in which that's a statute violation, I have zero sympathy. And we are seeing those cases come to Illinois, and it makes our clinicians bananas. So I will recommend a forthcoming talk to you, or article to you, that's called Dark Alley Ethics: How Hospitals Should Interpret Life and Health Exceptions to Bans on Abortion Provision.
From Ian Mitchell. I am living in Canada, which was described as an outlier with some exceptions internationally in the Western world. Why is this argument so divisive, specifically in the USA?
Gosh, I think that everyone on this call will have their own opinion, and such a range of opinions on the answer to that. I mean, I've offered one, which is the holding on to gender roles, and the choice of some religious groups historically to make this their issue and be involved in politics in certain ways. So I think there's many answers to this, and I'm not the most qualified person to say decisively, here's why.
From Ron Huff, what is the appropriate role of ethicists and professional ethics organizations on the topic of abortion?
Well, I think it's to raise it every time they can, and to tolerate discomfort, our own discomfort. I've had lots of colleagues come to me and say, I don't know how to teach this. I don't know how to talk about this. And I'm always happy to help. And I think it's an obligation to learn how to do so. We're all swimming in the same cultural soup, in our local context. And for some people, it's more of a challenge than others. But to choose not to do it is to throw women under the bus and say, my comfort is more important than their health. And no ethicist I know, when phrased that way, would say that's an okay thing to do. So the answer is nuanced, depending on, for like particular individual ethicists, of what kind of state you live in. But being useful, being a resource and advocating for your patients is, I think, never the wrong way to go. And I think Heather Shipley had a question about access to.
Yes, I just saw this because somebody else referred to it. Heather Shipley said,
okay, good.
The problem is the chat box keeps moving. Black women are more likely to have infant mother mortality across all income levels and regardless of access to healthcare. Is that considered in longitudinal study? And thank you to Lydia Smith Osborne.
Yeah, I'm not sure in terms of longitudinal study. Your qualifier seems really important here. I mean, there's a whole maternal M&M research body of research that looks at that. But when you say longitudinal study, I'm not quite sure how to address exactly what you're looking for. I think overlapping the abortion, I'm trying to highlight how abortion works with that morbidity and mortality, and how we might see more of it with that. But I'd love to engage with you more on this topic.
Let's see, from Darlene Fusco, a interesting take on this. Do you know, are regulated vasectomies something being discussed in parallel with abortion?
I've not heard it. Yeah, so I mean, I embrace the spirit of what you're saying, and of course I reject the specifics, because I'm for reproductive autonomy for everybody. I've been troubled by statistics that say there's a uptick in tubal ligation and vasectomy rates, because that's people out of fear not reproduce, closing doors on their reproduction maybe before they were ready to, out of fear of what would happen if they had an unintended pregnancy. And that's a deprivation. Related to Ms. Shipley's question, they're journalists are the ones who've been documenting the harm to women with these, the lack of, or the incredibly narrow and the narrowly interpreted life and health exceptions. There's one NPR report, I don't remember the patient's name, where she was in Louisiana. She was denied a miscarriage care, and she was just home ill, thinking, is this how they treat Black women? Is it because I'm Black, or because they think it's an abortion? And that she reported that she and her husband really wanted to have a second child, but they've decided not to because it's too dangerous to be pregnant and Black in Louisiana. So they're not going to have a second child, is where their decision making is right now. That is a complete denial of reproductive justice and reproductive freedom, right? That she doesn't feel safe, that she can be taken care of to pursue her procreative plans.
On a similar vein, from Jaleh Jafari, I wonder, excuse me, if reframing contraception as a male responsibility, not just condoms, but producing birth control pills, implants, etc., targeting the male body and making this more common, would somehow alter the view of abortion.
I don't know if it would alter the view of abortion, but I welcome that technological future. I think we all made fun of that study that was reported in the newspapers on male contraception. And when men felt a little nauseous and a little bit of discomfort, they discontinued the study because it was not okay for the subjects. And women everywhere were like, I'm sorry, what? You felt what? And you stopped the study? I think there's actually some really very preliminary but very promising male contraceptive gel research actually coming out, I just learned about. So there is research in that area, and I think it's way overdue. Another issue is women have tubal ligations at a much higher rate than men have vasectomies, even though it's a higher risk procedure. And for many of those folks, they're in long-term partnerships, sexual partnerships, where that's the reason they want to definitively end their procreative capacity. So I would say actually reducing our tubal rate and increasing our vasectomy rate would be the greatest contribution of men to contraception. The rates are shocking. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I just remember my eyes doing a cartoon pop when I read them.
Let's see, the DOMS decision is also having a major impact for women in clinical research. I hope this can be part of future discussions protecting women and their care providers.
Yeah, you make a great point, Ms. Heidelberg, and I hope you'll give that lecture. I am not on a research ethicist, and so I always feel like, there's something to be said there, but I maybe I'm not the right person to say it. Let me throw in a plug that those of you at Tulane can talk about this, the impact on clinical training. I did not address at all. Right. And as a medical educator, that is near and dear to my heart, that we're going to have a whole generation of OBGYNs who can't do excellent miscarriage management as well as abortion care is problematic medically.
Jasmine, how do the laws affect kids under 18 seeking an abortion? Are there any exceptions in any of the states for kids?
Yeah, no, there are not exceptions for kids per se. So when you say any of the states, I'm guessing you mean states with abortion bans, that would they allow kids? And the answer is no. In Illinois, we just repealed our parental notification based on the data that the vast majority of teenagers involve their parents. Those who don't have good reasons not to, they were getting 100% granting on the judicial bypass. So it was just delaying their abortions. They have to do through a public shaming ritual or, in front of a judge. Notice only the girls, not the boys, have to talk about their sex life in front of a judge. Right. And that they involve a trusted adult, but it might be a aunt or a teacher, when they can't involve their parents. So, states are doing all different things, but the bans don't have exception for kids, which is very concerning in terms of safety.
Marcia Glass points out that regarding Dr. Fusco's point, there is a recent book published about shifting responsibility narrative completely towards men using contraceptive measures as routinely as we would expect them to use seatbelts.
Yes, I have a son in first grade, I will share. And one of the other mothers of first graders is a nurse, and our boys are best friends. And she just read the book Ejaculate Responsibly. And she was like, we have to have a convo about how we raise our boys to like understand that this is their job. And I was like, I think I'll be having that conversation all my life.
Haley Director states, research has shown that ways to decrease unintended pregnancies and therefore abortions is to increase access to sex ed in schools. However, many abortion ban states also limit access to sex ed. How can we as healthcare researchers and bioethicists improve communication with legislators and encourage them to develop evidence-based policy based on this information?
It's a great question, Ms. Director. And I think there are so many cultural obstacles. So that question presumes that if we gave them the evidence, they would develop evidence-based policy. And sometimes that's true. And I have done a little legislative work in this area, and there are certainly people who, when you explain it to them the way you understand it, they make shifts. If their belief is that women are made to have babies, and you tell them that if you give them sex education, they will have less babies, that will not be persuasive to a different kind of cultural belief or role of sexuality, procreation in someone's worldview. And are people honest about their worldviews? Are they even completely aware of, or you know what I mean, like versus those sort of unconscious frameworks many of us work with and we're not even aware of or we don't want to own. So I'm 100% with you, and I could make a different map of the sex ed programs and the teen pregnancy rates in states, and it's not a pretty map. I mean, so I want to affirm your premise that sex education leads to decreased birth rates, but then we have the incredible absurdity of states that ban sex education, or limit it in incredible ways, and then have these incredible teen birth rates. In my book, I talk about Utah as an example. And then teenagers are in this difficult position, and now living in banned states, even more difficult.
So Carol Gerson, who had been also from Northwestern, I am aware of pregnant women who will not visit Louisiana because of fear of what will happen if they have a complication while here. And then follows later on in the conversation, in general, men are rating these laws. Remember that ED drugs, erectile dysfunction drugs, were covered by insurance when birth control was not.
Yeah, I mean, that was actually the pivot point where oral contraception did become covered by insurance, because again, advocates were able to say, are you kidding?
Look over there. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the idea of a pharmaceutical equity suddenly flew. But I agree, male sexuality is protected and celebrated. Female sexuality is, we have a very conflicted Madonna horror relationship with, and so the idea of educating women with sex ed means they could be educated to say no, they could be educated to say yes. And if you give them contraception, they can have yes, they can say yes without, and have sex without pregnancy, the fear of pregnancy stopping them. Right? So that is a gender revolution that, as in my book, I put it, that women could have sex without pregnancy. When you combine it with the backup plan of abortion, can do what men have been able to do for millennia. That is, a historian will tell you, a cultural historian, an incredible change that is very threatening to gender roles.
Marcia Glass has added that writer made the point that fertile men are continuously fertile, whereas women are only fertile during ovulation, but continuously expected to prevent contraception with meds and other invasive interventions.
Yeah, it's an extension of women's parenting. Like, we're responsible for the babies, we're responsible for the sex, to have the contraception if we don't want to have babies. It's yeah.
Sal Fernandez asks, let's see, do you have any thoughts on how we might promote the framing? Because he said, actually, let me add the prefatory sentence. I love the framing of your discussion in terms of the pregnant patient, as opposed to exclusively focusing on the moral status of the fetus. Do you have any thoughts on how we might promote this framework in our discussions of abortion, given the importance that many place on the fetus? In short, how do we persuade others to consider the pregnant person?
I mean, just say it over and over, Mr. Fernandez. Start, teaching, lecturing at the dinner table. Just make it your framework and share it with others. And I hope I've made it clear. I'm very interested. A person can honor the moral status of women and their decisions or beliefs about the moral status of embryos and fetuses could still lead them to say, I can't support abortion, whether it's legally or ethically. But if they haven't put her in the mix, we're having a very different conversation. So I think that's I'm gratified that you want to pick that up, and I just want to say, grab it and run. And I've tried to produce literature in articles and in my book that supports this work and can go into course packs and can help people. I don't want to say rehearse, but get comfortable with language that maybe they haven't used before, because it's just a complete erasure of women, right? If all you do in a philosophy class is talk about embryos and fetuses as if they float in space, I'm done. I'm tired, and it's just not okay. And so, never doing our teaching like that. And the second piece is my pluralism framing. That I want to live in a country where we can be neighbors and think very differently from one another. So in classrooms, when we ask students, I just taught a philosophy class at University of Chicago as a guest, and I said, let's just start this conversation by saying these conversations can feel very threatening to people with uteruses, because people are speaking abstractly about whether they will be forced to create another person or not. So let's all frame our conversation, and here's what I think for me, and separate it from a legislative conversation. So no one feels attacked by anyone else's working out their philosophical position, that we can have a brave space where we can say what we really think and we can challenge each other, but we're not degrading each other implicitly or explicitly in a way that was set up for the professor set us up to do. And that we're going to consider all these factors.
I graduated from medical school 40 years ago now. So when I entered, it was in the late 70s. And I had the opportunity to speak to attending physician about the horrors of what happened in terms of people who went to abortion providers who were not like legitimate abortion clinics that exist today.
Yeah.
And the horrors of the outcomes and the deaths that ensued. It was a valuable object lesson. As a family physician, I've seen the impact of ethnicity and poverty on what happens in terms of women being able to make these decisions. But the part that was sort of teed up by the one person talking about sex ed, I actually look at as a broader inequity issue, and that is for education generally.
Yeah.
And if you have people who are kept poor and less well educated, they will have an inability to access the same services as those of us who are economically and educationally well endowed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So that needs to be part of the future. If you want to look at it, it has to be all aspects of SES.
Oh, yeah.
And how do we improve the lot in life for people who, because one of the things you could also overlay on that map where you saw the various states is, okay, how did these states do in terms of their educational scores? And you will see very similar types of scores in terms of how we're doing in the Deep South.
And one of the 4 domains of the NEKC is education for child welfare. Absolutely. Right. So true.
Let's see. Are there any questions?
We've got Carol Gerson saying, where did the separation of church and state go? I'm with you. I think that was rejected in the Bray case. In other cases, the court saying, well, you don't have to be religious to oppose abortion. I think that's true demographically. You don't have to be a weekly churchgoer to think abortion is unethical. But I do think that I agree with your view that, so much of that is determined by the religious stream. And then Ms. Director writes about the religious freedom suits, and I think a lot of these statutes are influenced by religious morality, but I feel like there's this Trojan horse argument that some folks have learned, if you say embryos and fetuses are people like you and me, people like me are respectful of them. If they say women should be chained to the stove, we don't give them a hot minute and I yell back at their protest, if they had that on their sign. So there's the Trojan horse argument that's sort of a gender anti-woman argument. And then there's a religious argument. Again, very sincere religious folks too, but sometimes it's hard the Catholic Church is a patriarchal religion, right? So how do you separate the gender piece from the religious piece? And I cite Catholics, I was raised Catholic, so I feel closer to that doctrine. You're allowed to have whatever religious doctrine you want, right, in the United States, and to live by it, but that's very different than governmental control. You ask where those cases might go, and I really have very mixed feelings. They make sense, and you think with this court being very, very strong on religious liberty, maybe they'd have legs, but with this court, I just don't see it happening. They were rejected in the past. Catholics for a Free Choice and other groups brought these cases in the 80s with Medicaid and other challenges, and they lost every time.
I think we have time for a couple of more questions before we wrap up. We have one from Tim Leahy. How much do you think the abortion debate is about the logical reasons you discuss admirably today versus a more emotional reaction to changing societal mores, i.e. to a perceived threat to some esteemed traditional way of being? I wonder if that latter front is where gains can be made where logic may fall short.
I'm absolutely with you. And every fact I presented, I think, has deep emotion behind it. When I talk about the personhood of women legally, I think you nailed it. And so we are talking about people's emotions. And I never try to tell people how to feel. I mean, it's sort of like, yes, that's mistake numero uno. For me, it's about well, I'm talking about law. Do your feelings control strangers' behavior? And we see this in gay rights cases, the idea that people I've never met and will never see, if they can get married, it degrades my marriage. Okay, that's a sensitivity and vulnerability we're going to have to toughen up a little bit, because that's not how it works in the United States, right? The idea that someone lives differently than me, somehow that hurts me. We want everyone supported. Equality is a fantasy, but equally as possible. And someone spoke to race and the idea of replacement theory. And I just want to say, it's not mine to say, but Loretta Ross, one of the founders of Reproductive Justice, I saw her give a talk a year or two ago. She's African-American, one of the founders, and she was laughing and she's saying, oh my gosh, this is about replacing white babies. If they could find a way to make abortion legal for Black women and illegal for white women, they would be paying for our bus fare to get there. She was very clear on the racial implications.
Why don't we end on this medical student question? This should be a required reading or a learning module, informative and approachable with many lines of thought to explore. I look forward to the future conversations with the schema you have eloquently provided, not to mention beneficial for the medical decisions our patients will make. Arguable for adequate informed consent due diligence. Thank you.
Oh, that's so nice. I agree with you. I will share. I have flown to medical schools in band states where students have organized and said, can you teach a optional night class? And 100 students show up, and it just warms my heart, because you're the generation that's going to figure this out and fix it, in my estimation. To the other point of how do we change this? Power doesn't give up without a fight. And I try, the way I get out of bed in the morning is to think of this as one of the last lunges of a wounded patriarchy. And they go big and they go hard when they're about to go down. And so the idea that women, you had the 30-year run of legislation and cases, and then 30 years to put it into action. And people like you, Lauren, are the product of that, 50% of the medical class, right? And all your female professors are products of that. And there are those who that's not okay and are going to do pretty desperate things. And to the person who wrote about the 13th Amendment, we don't have time to get into that clearly, but I mean, capturing women's bodies and forcing them to reproduce on behalf of another person, the slavery argument is strong, I think. And think about what a desperate move that is, that you had 49 years to change hearts and minds. It didn't happen. And so now you're using the force of criminalization of medicine and jail threats to try to do what you couldn't do via the First Amendment. That's shocking. And I hope it will change. It needs to change, and your generation will contribute mightily to that.
So, Dr. Watson, I am very pleased to have been able to moderate this wonderful presentation by you and the excellent feedback and questions from our audience across the country today. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to be here, and so grateful for all the hard work all of you in Louisiana are doing for your patients and your students and your researchers. Keep it up and call me if I can support your work anyway, either way. Bye-bye.